If there's one program in college football that has received a complete overhaul during this offseason, of course, that would be at the University of Washington. We talked to Lars Hansen, of course. It's UW Fan Nation. It's Lockdown Huskies, and we appreciate Lars always stopping by to break down the Huskies for us. Lars, how you doing today?
Good. Yeah, it's a new day. Still great, overcast, typical Seattle weather in April, which I personally don't complain about because I'd rather not be scorching. But I will say, yeah, it's a brand new day in Huskyland because, yeah, I think we decided that there's probably a consensus two starters on the entire team returning, which to me in college football, I know there's roster turnover, but that is something short of. Not, I don't even think TCU can touch that.
Yeah, this is one of the more unprecedented situations, maybe in the history of college football, when you take the entirety of the situation to go from the top, new conference, new head coach, new coaching staff, new players on both sides of the football, because the combination of the new conference and the transfer portal, we've never seen that, along with the new head coach, which obviously brings a new coaching staff. You're covering a new football team.
Yeah, honestly, I'm glad you mentioned that because every now and then we kind of, even some of the local media in Seattle will kind of just be joking at practice, like, oh, yeah, we are going to Iowa City. We are going to Happy Valley. We're not going to, Ogden, Utah, or not Utah, but Salt Lake City, Utah, and maybe some more typical traditional trips that we've taken over the years. So, yeah, it is kind of nice though, because I mean, we've known college football has been evolving for years. We've seen it all coming. Again, each year it seems to just be picking up more and more. And this year in 24, with the conference realignment and Washington and the other three schools going out to the Big Ten, it's going to be a new world. But I think you either get in or you get out. And Washington had to get in because, again, if you're going to be competing for national championships in this decade, you're probably one of the programs that's actually up there in college football. You're not kind of getting the luck of the draw, as it were.
Okay, Lars, we're going to take you off the field and go the legal route to start out to get that cleared and out of the way. A very unfortunate situation. You did fill us in a number of times around the college football playoff time and late in the season about one Tybo Rogers, who this past Friday, actually a week ago, so about 10 days ago, arrested by Seattle police, booked in King County Jail, as reported by a number of sites at this point. He was charged Tuesday with second-degree rape, third-degree rape, and his bail was set for $150,000 in each case. Another unfortunate situation with a young man going a bad way. And also this, because of the site of the arrest, as you mentioned to me before we started to record, that caused quite a scene as well.
Yeah, the 3900 block of Montlake Boulevard, which, if you know the UW campus area, that's right outside Husky Stadium, effectively. And so this was around 9 a.m. on that Friday morning. The team they practiced Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Tybo was absent from Saturday's practice. The coincidence there was that was also the first time we saw Bill Belichick at practice with his coaching clinic. And let's just say we weren't exactly searching out Tybo Rogers as the first. Oh, hey, this guy's not here. It's like, oh yeah, midway through practice, Tybo's not here. Yeah, and so else is not here. Oh yeah, good point. Yeah, interesting. We'll get back to that because at that point the arrest had not been public knowledge. It came out, I believe, on Monday or Tuesday. I believe Tuesday, kind of early morning, afternoonish, that he had been arrested and released, because on that Tuesday he ended up being charged. So he was arrested on Friday and then charged the following Tuesday. And it was unfortunate on many levels because, again, you never want to have anybody that potentially allegedly commits a sexual act like that around your program. And then it was, to make matters 10,000 times worse, it was the way in which it was handled, where under the previous coach, Kalen DeBoer, he had been suspended in fall camp for a completely separate relation before the October and November sexual assaults allegedly happened, although allegedly just because, again, he has not been convicted in the court of law. But if you go and read the police reports, it is absolutely grotesque and heinous. So I'm only just saying that for legalese sake. But ends up coming back to the team in September, plays as a kind of third running back behind Dylan Johnson, who ended up basically carrying the team to the national championship from a running back perspective. Was suspended in November after the first kind of allegation came out. There was nothing, he wasn't arrested. There was nothing legally that came from it, but it kind of, their smoke started to come about. And then before the Pac-12 championship game, he was suspended, or not suspended, but they didn't travel him. And they had traveled him every single game up until then. and it was a little, well, not every single game because the suspension, but I believe every game but one he had traveled to, and the point of which I'm getting at was they cited, oh well, we can't travel the entire team. Kalen didn't make it a case of, oh, he's actually suspended. It was more or less just, we couldn't take it. We're going to give that carry to Richard Newton, which again didn't really make a ton of sense at the time. And then to make things worse, he returns to the team for the Sugar Bowl against Texas and the national championship against Michigan with the coaching staff. And again, Kalen came out, released a statement saying, I take allegations seriously, et cetera, et cetera. The typical, coach speak from, what you would expect in a public statement like that. But the coaching staff clearly knew and still allowed him to play. Now, again, because there wasn't a formal charge, they could, lean on that and say, well, hey, he wasn't charged with anything. We did an internal investigation in between November and December. They ultimately, based on that, deemed him fair to play. And just kind of it really, we all kind of in the Seattle media that knew about this, which again, we had all been kind of waiting for that formal charge that never came. And so it's a real gray area to walk, right? Because again, for the university, you can't kick him off the team or do anything because it turns out that he's innocent. Now you all kind of look on the back end of that, you're facing punitive damages and things like that. But this is still just an absolutely heinous situation. And now Tybo, he's going to have to deal with this. And I would have to imagine this is one where football becomes second, third, fourth, priorities, because again, it doesn't matter, what you can do on the field. If you commit an act like this and multiple acts like this, where you're deemed an actual, like, we don't know if we release you tonight that you won't go and commit another heinous act tonight or tomorrow. That was the point of where the police were at with Tybo, which ultimately led to his arrest. And so that's just a glaring concern. And so Jed Fish spoke about it on that Tuesday when the news broke. Jed, to be clear for the audience, because one reporter didn't know that at the time, he was not the head coach that played Tybo last season, that made those ultimate decisions to play him against Texas and Michigan. But once they found out that, he's still on the team in terms of he's suspended, but he's permanently away from the team, I don't expect him to rejoin. And so it's basically just going to have to play out the legal process from here. But I would be very surprised if Tybo Rogers ever plays for Washington again.
All I can say is it's a sad situation for him personally, but more importantly, hopefully he's held accountable and the legal system works. And again, we have seen other situations like it where the legal system has let us down, but hopefully it works and he's held accountable and justice is served. Lars Hansen's here from UW Fan Nation, also Locked On Huskies. All right, Lars, let's talk some football. And again, it's just starting to sink in once we started this conversation about the the newness of this football team and this football program. I am thinking this is unprecedented. So what does a Jed Fish-led football program look like compared to Kalen DeBoer, as much as you can possibly gather without them obviously hitting the field to play a game?
Well, a couple things off the bat. One, both being offensive coaches, the offense has kind of taken the focal point, of what there is in spring ball to talk about. Because again, for Washington, you're breaking in 3 new quarterbacks, one a graduate transfer for all intents and purposes in Will Rogers, the former Mississippi State quarterback, and then 2 freshman quarterbacks in Damon Williams Jr. and DeMarcius Davis. Damon was committed, signed, and I believe enrolled at Arizona when Jed Fish took the job, so he ended up having to transfer portal. DeMarcius was committed to Washington, signed, and ended up staying. Was recruited by the Arizona staff under Jimmy Doherty, and so the quarterback coach Jimmy Doherty. So there was a prior connection there. But when we've seen kind of just what the offense is going to look like, I think it's not going to be totally similar to Kalen, because I think scheme and concepts and things like that are a little bit different. Again, both very effective offenses. So I think that from that perspective, that's not going to change. But one thing I will say, I don't think, to your point about things that are kind of unprecedented, I have never covered a college football team that had practice last names, jerseys, in practice, in spring practice, where you have your jersey number and your last name on every single player's jersey. Whereas part of it has got to be for the coaches to say, oh yeah, that so-and-so, that's your name. I'm not just going to shout out number 54, because in college, unlike the NFL, you have there we go. You have you have multiple players wearing the same number. Where Jed Fish was on the bullhorn one practice and said holding on Fowler 54. He actually gave Drew Fowler a scholarship retroactive to last season as one of the backup linebackers. But again, these coaches are still learning them. So I kind of wonder if that's part of it. And then you factor in the NIL era, practice is open to the public. So kind of knowing who these players are, not just seeing a number. I think it's a little bit of a unique touch. And then you go on the defensive side. And he's hired Steve Belichick, obviously Bill Belichick's son, coming over from the New England Patriots. And let me tell you, Steve Belichick is everything that you would think he is, in that he sounds absolutely like his father, very not no nonsense, but just kind of is who he is. He's not gonna change his personality. He certainly hasn't. He's funny in ways that Bill was, where he kind of says not quirky things, but just kind of in that Belichick-esque mold of talking and that cadence and that sound. Everything's the same. And then you kind of add, there's been some VIP fanfare, which Kalen DeBoer didn't necessarily have. Kalen DeBoer leaned more into the former players. Like he brought back Marcus Peters. He brought back a number of players that hadn't been around the program over the past 4 or 5 years under Jimmy Lake and Chris Peterson. So he brought kind of the UW community together. And now Jed is kind of bringing all of Seattle together and saying, hey, we're going to bring in Jack Del Rio. We're going to bring in Bill Belichick, all these coaches, John Lynch's son, all that, and have them at practice and be around this team. It's kind of a way of saying, hey, we're the 33rd NFL team. So in that respect, there's maybe some marketing kind of just philosophical approaches to how to build a program, but pretty much the two are not that drastically different in terms of, they're not going saying, oh, hey, we're going to run the ball, 3 yards in a cloud of dust. The offense isn't changing that much. Schemes will be different, but overall, from that perspective, they're not that much different.
And of course, you went through the quarterback room. Most importantly, as long as he stays healthy, Will Rogers. And the comparisons are, of course, going to be made despite all the football that Will Rogers has played. And I noted in my quarterback rankings for Big Ten that Will Rogers, just with a typical season, is going to soar up the all-time records across college football and is already the all-time completions holder in college football. I believe I'll double check that number, but just the difference between he and Michael Penix and what type of skill set he's going to provide versus what we saw with Penix.
Yeah, that's basically, if I were to have a kind of blanket message to any Husky fan or just anybody trying to find out about Washington in general, you have to just set aside Michael Penix. Okay, when Michael Penix was the arm strength, the downfield zip that he had, where he could throw it 70 yards on a dime in between 3 defenders and make it look effortless, that's something that's not going to come back in college football, necessarily at Washington, because Will Rogers, if you look at throughout his career, has been kind of 15 yards and behind the line of scrimmage type of quarterback. He does have a downfield deep ball, but it's nowhere near what Penix's was. Will Rogers is more of the point guard quarterback. Let me get the ball into my skill position hands. Again, the famous Mike Leach air raid offense. Just get the ball. You have 5 routes, figure it out, sort of thing. But I do believe he actually has shown a decent deep ball in fall camp. So certainly nowhere near what Penix was. Again, Penix is an anomaly in so many ways, but then that's all credit to Penix, because I don't think there's really any other quarterback that you can point to and say, yeah, he has that type of arm coming back in college football. But the one thing I have noticed kind of on Will Rogers is the one thing that's hard to kind of caveat with this offense right now is the offensive line that all 3 quarterbacks are working with are not anywhere near what they're going to be working with in about 3 or 4 months. And that's just with the spring transfer portal coming in. And I mean, right now you have, I would say, 1 guaranteed offensive lineman starting in Drew Azzopardi, the right tackle, and then 4 open spots. And even in the second team, you have some open spots because, again, you're talking about redshirt freshmen who haven't played. And right now, I think they're playing 3 walk-ons along the second team offensive line. So if that would just give you any indication of the number of available bodies in that room, you're not going to get a true assessment of what Will Rogers can do with some of these guys, because the defense is looking so good. Just kind of they have literally been taking a knee on the defensive line during some of their drills just to, like, hey, you're going to get pressure from this side or this side. We're not just going to make it unfair because otherwise you guys wouldn't be able to really execute the offense. And that's just no disrespect to the players that are playing. It's just when you have scholarship junior defensive linemen and edge rushers that are seniors who have years and years of experience in college football going against a redshirt freshman walk on left guard or right guard. I think you and I both can just assess that that's not going to be a good way to assess what the offense actually is. But I do think Will Rogers is going to be a fine fit in this offense.
Talking to Lars Hansen, breaking down the Huskies. They've got a late, by most standards, late spring game coming up here. It's on May 3rd. It's a Friday night. They're in Seattle. So the Huskies still have quite a bit of work to do at spring practice before they hit that final destination. But the transfer portal is open. And while we brought that up, Lars, where would you expect Jed Fish to be targeting? It sounds like the offensive line, first and foremost.
Right. So Brendan Carroll said they're going to probably add 5 or 6 offensive linemen in the portal. Literally just kind of came out and said that about a week and a half ago. Again, obviously can't name names, right? But just they already know for a fact they're basically going for 5 offensive linemen. That doesn't mean all 5 will be starters because again, there's some backups that they probably want to bring along as well and things like that. But they basically are looking for an entire starting offensive line aside from the right tackle. They did bring in Marcus Bryant, the SMU transfer. Another spot they're looking at is defensive line. They brought in the Indiana transfer, Philip Bleedy. I personally, having talked with him a couple of times, I wouldn't be surprised if he ended up at Washington. I know he's got some other big time visits, but just his visit to Seattle, I think, checked every single box. It's just a matter of can Washington withstand the next 3 trips of Auburn, Oklahoma, and LSU. Which again, anytime in just calling a spade. You go in the air, the transfer portal area in college football where you can do NIL and things like that. Washington's not afraid to, dip their toes into that water. But again, you kind of just got to handle that gauntlet first and make sure you can still reel them in, which I think they probably will. There's a few other positions. They need at least one tight end. They're potentially, believe it or not, looking at a running back. That room is pretty stacked with Jonah Coleman coming from Arizona, Cam Davis coming off an lower leg injury we believe it was the knee, but I'm just going to say lower leg injury, lower body injury from last season. He's still working back, still isn't full go in practice, kind of doing some rehab stuff while working with the second team and third team. But I would expect a healthy Cam Davis to be probably running back too. Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt's one running back they had been looking at for a while when he was in the portal. I don't know if that's still a potential, but that's kind of what they're looking for is that third running back option that, solid, safe. We just want to have an upperclassman because Tybo would have been a sophomore. They do have Daniel Ngata, who's getting some reps there. Adam Muhammad's a freshman running back. So that room is pretty stacked, but I do think they might look at one player at running back. Other than that, I mean, personally, I think they're going to have to add somebody either at safety or linebacker. But then again, the more we see through spring ball, I don't think they need it as much as I thought they did. Again, if you want to have a one-off senior safety and some starter, another insert whoever decides to enter the portal, okay, yeah, you might take a look at that. But I don't think it's necessarily as much of a need as I thought it was coming into spring ball.
Lars, whether it be either side of the ball, is there anybody in particular that intrigues you? Just their skill set, their ability to possibly break through?
Yeah. So I mean, I throw a dart, take a dartboard, throw it at any of the defensive backs. Ephesians Prysock, the cornerback transfer from Arizona, is every bit of 6'4". Kind of one thing I think that just to give a whole encompassing thing. One thing I do think that Washington is also returning to under Jed Fish is having an actual DBU sense again, where you go back to Jimmy Lake and the 2014 through 2018 era before he became head coach and everything went downhill. He actually was one of the best defensive back coaches in college football. I think that's a fair assessment to say during that run with Buda Baker, Kevin King, all the Sidney Jones, all those guys that they were able to churn out. John Richardson has kind of brought that back at Washington with Armand Hawkins and a few others. And so I think Ephesians Prysock, if he can really have a strong year in the Big Ten, that could go a long way. With Jordan Shaw, also a former Indiana player who I believe he played 4 games last year for Indiana. I could be wrong, but went to Arizona, then followed the staff up to Washington via Indiana. So I think this pretty much any guy in the secondary is kind of where I've been keeping my eye on. And then one player I go on offense is Denzel Boston, where Washington has to replace Roma Dunze, Jalen McMillan, and Jalen Polk. Pretty much an impossible task on top of replacing an entire starting offensive line, a Heisman runner-up at quarterback, and a 1,000-yard rusher at running back. Clearly a tall task, but Denzel Boston, I mean, I don't want to say Larry Fitzgerald ball skills with Anquan Bolden, but he really has impressed me this spring. And he was a guy that impressed me last fall camp, but he was just buried behind three, day 2 picks, if not, and then a top 10 pick in Roma Dunze. So he wasn't going to be able to see the field as much last season. But Denzel Boston, paired with Giles Jackson and Jeremiah Hunter, I think is actually going to be a pretty reputable receiver core this year. It's not going to be nowhere near what that trio did last season, much like Will Rogers is not going to be Michael Penix 2.0. But I don't think that fall off will be as big as what we initially expected coming into spring ball.
Lars Hansen's here from UW Fan Nation, Lockdown Huskies. Join him there on a regular basis, tracking the Huskies. We appreciate Lars stopping by as always. Please like the video, folks. Subscribe right here at the Voice of College Football. In terms of Jedd Fisch's approach, which you've addressed, but also his expectations or stated expectations, has he tried to stay away from that because he's walking into a situation where obviously the goals and the achievements were so lofty the last 2 seasons, and now he's kind of in a no-win situation if people are holding him to those kind of standards. So is he acknowledging that publicly to say, hey, we're starting over here? Or what has been the statements that he's made in that way?
Yeah, no, actually, to your point, I'm glad you mentioned that, because in that regard to Kalen DeBoer, Kalen couldn't be more night and day than Jedd Fisch. Jedd is a natural on the microphone. He's leaned into it very clearly. He even said openly, "Well, why would I have low goals why would I say we want 10,000 fans? Why not have 40? Say I want to have 40,000 fans or 30,000 fans at our spring game." When they've never really had more than, I'm just going to say, 10,000, at least in the last 2 decades. Let's just say in realistic times. I heard a story from Dan Riley where they went to the King Dome back in the day and did like this, what is absolutely not a modern day spring game. I'll just put it that way. And so I don't necessarily know where Jedd Fisch got the record of 30,000 fans at a spring game is what they want to surpass. But he basically said, well, why would we set the bar so low? Like, what's the point in that? We have all these resources here. And I think that's one thing that kind of Jedd has been grateful for with Washington is clearly he did not have the resources at Arizona that he now has at Washington. And whatever those resources are, whether that's NIL, just within the administration, whatever he ends up citing it as, because he hasn't necessarily said it's one specific thing. But having all those resources, Jedd knows, well, okay, I don't have it out here. I don't have, oh, well, they didn't give me a big coaching budget, so I kind of had to work, and that's why it's harder to rebuild than we initially thought. No, Pat Chung and previously Troy Danny basically said, hey, look, here's what you need. Football is the moneymaker here. We're going to the Big Ten for football. We're not going there for baseball and women's soccer, with no disrespect to either of those sports. It's like your football is what's carrying Washington to the Big Ten, right? So in order to keep that sustained success going against the Ohio States, the Michigans, even the Michigan States, who reinvested in their football program this past offseason with Jonathan Smith and everybody that also used to be at Washington. So there's going to be a big Washington feel in the Big Ten next season at multiple schools. But with that being said, Jedd knows they're not holding Jedd to the, hey, you got to get us a national championship or a playoff appearance. I don't think anybody's expecting that in year one. But with the way that he's also talked on the recruiting trail, where, hey, we want this to be the best recruiting class Washington has ever had. Well, how do you quantify the best, right? Are we talking in the 247 era? Are we talking in the go back to the newspaper blue chip era? Well, either way, he's kind of just saying these things knowing, well, we're going to hold ourselves to this standard, whatever you want to quantify that as, where we look at the end of the year and say, oh, well, Washington ranked, 12th on 247's team rankings for the 25 class. Well, they finished maybe 11th or 10th a couple years back with Peterson in 1 year or whatever. But either way, whether they achieve that highest ranking, I think it's more or less Jedd saying, hey, no, I'm not setting the bar here. I'm setting the bar here. I'd rather fall short here than fall short here, or match it here, but I'm only winning 6 or 7 games. Like, Jedd knows he needs to be winning 9+ every year, even in the Big Ten, which I know is a big ask, but let's say in this first year, if they go 8-4 or 9-3, that they're probably 7-5, 8-4, that'll get them a pass with a bowl win getting to 8 or 9. But in year 2, 3, and 4, you need to have 9-10 in that ballpark before you get into the playoff. And then you need to be making those playoff appearances, I would say, at least every year or every other year with the expanded playoff format.
Folks, if you leave a comment below, leave your record prediction because I am guessing, as Lars just mentioned, that we will get more 7-5 predictions than any. That is my guess because that's what I'm seeing out there. I haven't dived into it, but if I was just going to pick a number out of the air before I've really dissected the team for my final predictions, 7-5 seems to be what comes to mind when you look at the schedule. Lars Hansen here, UW Fan Nation, Locked On Huskies. Please track Lars. You see the X handle right there. You can go right there and track all of his work. Anything else we need to know about what you've got going on these days, Lars?
No, I mean, just put out the Locked On podcast Monday through Friday. I'm assuming Roman and I are going to wait to not have a live show about their newest commitment, so we'll just have that out for our Tuesday show. But yeah, looking forward to getting the rest of the spring ball done because I will say I'm not a fan of the 6:30 Friday night spring game because also the way Jed is doing his media is not exactly what I was hoping for. Kalen was a little friendlier in that regard, but either way, it's a new day in college football, and at least Washington is trying to compete with the big boys. So that's all we can ask for.
Lars, appreciate you stopping by. It's always insightful. Always appreciate the conversation.
Thanks, Mark. Anytime, you know it.